Welcome to the Africa Urban Lab podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Lockhart. Today, I'm chatting with Joe Studwell, author of several books, including the influential book, How Asia Works, and his new book, How Africa Works, which we talked to him about today in depth. Enjoy the show. All right, Joe Studwell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you got a new book out, How Africa Works. It follows up on your fantastic 2013 book, How Asia Works. So let's just start off here having you briefly summarize just the main message of the new book, and then we'll dive into things.
Well, the main message took a long time to discover because I went back through the Africa literature and I read all the stuff that you've probably read about how it's all about governance failure and corruption and kleptocracy and civil strife and ethnic conflict. But I read all that stuff and I felt that I was reading a lot of kind of proximate explanations. They weren't really fundamental explanations of why Africa has lagged in developmental terms. And eventually in the sort of 60s and the 50s, I got back to one or two people, and it really was only one or two people who wrote about African demographics and said, Africa is absolutely constrained because it just doesn't have enough people. And there are very good reasons why you can't develop without enough people, because you don't have markets, you particularly don't have dense markets. Your infrastructure costs in a continent as vast as Africa are unbearably high, right? The cost of a road, when you've got too few people, you can't amortize it across a sufficiently big population. You don't have the division of labor. You don't have a number of other things that are usually put by economists under the rubric of agglomeration economies. Mm-hmm. So none of that was there. I mean, if you go back to 1960, across the whole continent, average demographic density in Africa was the same as Europe, estimates of Europe in 1500, right? So how much growth was there in Europe in 1500? I mean, there wasn't any, right? And sure enough, after 1960, Africa didn't do a great job of growing. So the book says, we've got to refocus on the demographic story. And if we look at the growth in population in Africa, which really kicks off from the 50s when the disease burden finally begins to be brought under control, right? With new drugs, with more screening for sleeping sickness and whatever, with more vaccination. And it's not about people having more kids of their own volition. It's about a reduction in the infant death rate, right? That's why population has grown in Africa. And that takes us forward then to today, when we are close now to the population density of about 50 people per square kilometer, where Asia was in 1960, just when Asia began to take off. So the big overarching message in the book is, you've got to understand the demographic story to understand why Africa has had the experience that it's had since the independence era began in the late 50s and early 60s.
Mm-hmm. And then, so you tell that demographic story kind of right at the start, and you return to it at the end. But can we also give a brief overview of kind of the three big kind of policy recipe items that you spend a lot of the book talking about, and you spent a lot of the How Asia Works book talking about as well, around agriculture, around manufacturing, and around sort of finance, the financial sector?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I've always done a lot of work on agriculture because in a poor country, definitionally, agriculture employs 3/4 of the population. So what happens in agriculture is enormously important for the bulk of the population. I then believe that manufacturing is the only way that economies can move quickly to a much more developed status. And that is basically because manufacturing upgrades the skill levels of the population in the way that you can't afford to do for services. Because to get value-added services, you need big investments in education and training that poor countries just can't afford to pay for. Whereas in manufacturing, it's much more that you start off in a textile mill and you end up, in an iPhone assembly or whatever, but you can be paid by the employer the whole way through that you're learning, so that manufacturing factories in East Asia have been the schools and colleges for many people. Um, so the book looks at the story there, and it makes the observation that exactly what you would expect with greater population density appears to be happening in Africa in agriculture. Because as a rule of thumb, if you get a bit of growth, a bit of GDP growth, when population doubles, demand for food will triple. And this is exactly what has been happening in Africa. So, of course, this has made over the last sort of 2, 3, 4 decades, begun to make farming quite profitable if you're close to a city or a town where there's solid, reliable demand. And so you see now a lot more farmer irrigated agriculture around towns and cities, and yields going up. I mean, yields go up by virtue essentially of irrigation and fertilizer application. And although fertilizer application across Africa is still, only around 20 kilos per hectare, there are people around cities in Africa who are happily putting 200, 300, 400 kilos per hectare on their land, just as they do in East Asian countries. So Africa, I think we're seeing exactly what we would expect. And when you go downstream from what's happening in the fields, you see the booming growth of agricultural processing, the manufacturing bit of agriculture, and you see the booming growth of processed foods, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter where you go in sub-Saharan Africa now. It's quite hard to find people, pounding their own maize. Okay, if you go into the far, far rural areas, but if you're around cities or in cities, people are consuming processed foods. And that, of course, requires all this value addition in the factories that process the food. So that's the agriculture bit. The manufacturing bit is much more sketchy at the moment. Manufacturing share of GDP in Africa is only about 11%. It needs to be a lot higher. And what I say in the book is that you can go to certain manufacturing enclaves, for instance, the garmenting enclave in Madagascar, or the garmenting enclave in Lesotho, or to the foreign invested manufacturing enclave in Tanger in Morocco. And there's no problem with the productive capabilities in these places. I mean, the firms are making money and the firms are able to grow, but it's just a few cases. And what we need to see is the development of manufacturing across Africa. And there I make the point that, the politicians just don't seem to be invested in this at the moment. They don't seem to kind of get it, or at least they don't want to confront that you just don't move fast without a manufacturing sector. A lot of people, seem to think that somehow services will do it, but this is a kind of a dangerous mindset, because it's going to put you in the same place that India was for a very long time, compared with China, where the Chinese took manufacturing very, very seriously, and the Indian government did not. And even though India today is growing faster, but India is still less than a fifth of the size of the Chinese economy with the same population, right? So that's the price of that mistake in policy terms. And then the final part is finance, where, the East Asian lesson is that you make finance serve your objectives in agriculture and manufacturing. And I make the point that is quite difficult in Africa now, because with the structural adjustment programs, most African countries privatize their banking systems. And when you fully privatize your banking system, what you get is banks that focus on consumer finance, because consumer finance is the most profitable thing to do for banks and the easiest thing. I mean, it's essentially just software that tells you whether this person should get the motorcycle loan or not, right?
Yeah.
But it does not help you grow a manufacturing economy. It's not supporting your farm economy. So laissez-faire in in a developing country in finance, I would suggest is a very dangerous thing. Um, However, I mean, there are things that can still be done. And I talked, for instance, about Rwanda, which, again, under IMF advice, privatized its banks, but has set out to develop a publicly owned investment bank to
Yep.
provide long-term credit to major developmental objectives. So there are a lot. If you're willing to engage and be a problem solver, there's plenty of stuff that can still be done in finance in Africa. Um, but the thing is, I would say that most of the good stuff that's coming out of Africa at the moment is coming out of the private sector and ordinary people and smallholder farmers. It's not coming from governments, and we need to see. We still need to see the quality and application of governance improve.
Mm.
Uh, but in some places, I think there is evidence of that. In Nigeria, I think governance looks to me to have improved. It's coming from a very low base, but it's getting better.
Yeah. We got rid of the fuel subsidies and had to endure a few years of pain as a result. But I wanted to back up a bit and maybe zoom out, because I think for 2026, right? This book is coming out at the beginning of 2026. These prescriptions around a kind of slightly more intervention in agriculture and manufacturing and the financial sector, they're a little they're a little more mainstream today. But I would say when you first wrote How Asia Works back in 2013, um, this was less common stance, right? Like advocating for much more industrial policy and intervention in agriculture, manufacturing, finance. Um, the more policy orthodoxy at the time that the IMF and the World Bank were advocating was these more Washington consensus policies. You mentioned structural adjustment. You mentioned kind of privatization. And at the time, around 2013, you had some smattering of a few, like Justin Lin was chief economist at the bank, I think, and had just left in 2012 or 2013, right when your book came out, and some other heterodox economists. But it was not common, right? And so I'm curious, like, number one, when you wrote that book, was it an active kind of writing approach where you were writing against these Washington consensus policies? And then number two, um, in the decade plus since the publication of that book, right, industrial policy has become much, much more of a mainstream part of the story of how economic growth happens. Did you kind of in the decade plus since publication play an active role in that sort of transition to industrial policy becoming more mainstream?
um, to take the second one first, I don't think I did play that much of an active role, but there were sort of odd things that happened. The the start of the Africa book, oddly enough, was the Ethiopians and the Rwandans both inviting me to go out and spend time and see what they were doing. And my initial response was, this is pointless. I don't know anything about Africa. And they and they said, well, it doesn't matter. You don't need to know anything about Africa. We want to know more about Asia. And I did that. And it was kind of sort of seeing in those two countries that there were civil servants who were like really serious about development and very well educated and educated in the sense of knowing the developmental literature, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
if you're interested, if you're hungry, I mean, the great thing these days is there's a massive literature out there that you can consume in order to help you think about what to do in your own country, because what you do in your own country will never be exactly the same, but it gets you thinking to look at what other people did.
Yeah. No, and I mean, reading especially your Ethiopia chapter, like under Meles Zenawi, skimming his thesis that he wrote, I think, while in power, like looking at that big bibliography, that's a who's who of like developmental ideas across the decades. And then the fact it wasn't just him, he had a bunch of his ministers and senior leaders of the Ethiopian regime also studying these same things, was was I think a revelation. And to your point of kind of the governance part being the binding constraint. In places like Ethiopia, where you have serious leadership, you can get, it seems, a lot done on the policy front
Yeah.
relatively
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Ethiopia was just like the Japanese in the 19th century, where the whole
Right.
thing kicked off in Asia, right? When they decided that they were going to go and look at the UK and look at Belgium and look at France and look at the and they taught. I mean, and the politicians, because you couldn't fly, the politicians disappeared for like a year plus
Yeah.
on these kind of research trips. Um, so I think, yeah, it was very like that. And that was very much sort of Melis's attitude. And I think it's the correct one. You've got to have that attitude of problems being soluble. This is why like engineers are often very good people to have around in developmental contexts, because engineers are problem solvers, right? And that, your basic engineer is a generalist.
Mm,
And when you say, how are we going to do this? They'll think it through and they'll usually have a sensible idea. Um,
mm,
the other question that you asked, Curtis, or the first question that you'd asked there was about, was I fighting against the orthodox consensus? Absolutely not. I mean, I was just describing what I believed had happened in East Asia in the East Asia book. Um, I'd read what some of the IMF and World Bank um, publications claimed had happened, but it just didn't fit with what I had, with what I'd seen living in East Asia and you know uh, and studying development. But I wasn't out to get the orthodox view by any means. I was just trying to write, what I think is um, an accurate view of development in East Asia. And of course, there was a very funny review of the book in The Economist, which is really pretty orthodox in its economics, and it was an absolutely glowing review. But it began by saying, "Of course, this newspaper cannot agree with most of what he says." Um, but I thought that was nice of them, really.
yeah. Okay, so you chatted a bit about demographics and sort of the emergence more recently, and especially moving forward this century, of urban centers being a sort of game changer, and you can get there. Africa will soon reach the threshold of Asian densities that Asia had in 1960 in the next few years here, which is
Yeah.
when things start to get interesting and kick off. Obviously, I'm at the Africa Urban Lab, so we care a lot about the rapid urban transition that we're seeing across the continent. Um, on this theme, right? I kind of want you to tell me, like, if this is apt, if you agree with this. I see your book as somewhat pushing back against the Lewis model a bit, right? Arthur Lewis famously won a Nobel Prize for this dual sector
Hmm.
model, where the urban industrial sector accumulates capital, which raises labor demand and pulls, basically, in his model, infinite surplus agricultural workers out of agriculture and into the modern sector. And you're kind of saying, number one, Africa didn't have basically infinite surplus agricultural
Yeah.
labor,
Yep.
and I think, interestingly, you've touched upon this. Interestingly, number two, you're saying actually urban demand provides the markets and incentives for making the investments to increase agricultural productivity. And you already mentioned, especially in these farms nearby and proximate to cities, right? Um,
Yeah.
Whereas basically Lewis sees the rural sector as sort of stagnant and unresponsive.
Yeah.
And I know in the book you have some stories about these urban professionals by day who are also like great farmers on the side. So can you tell some of these stories?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that, yeah, I'm not fully aligned with Lewis, but I think that what Lewis wrote at the time he wrote it for a population dense society was insightful and useful. But you're right, it's not terribly helpful in Africa. And of course, all of these things are are simplifications that allow us to kind of make points about life, which is that much more complex
Right.
and more messy. Um, but yes, I think that for me, and in Africa, what we see is that the development of cities and the development of towns provides a type of demand that agriculture has never had before on the continent. So, I mean, if you go back to 1900, the two biggest cities in Africa were Dar and Lagos, with populations of 20,000 people, right? 20,000 people does not move the needle. But these days, when you've got so many cities, not including in Tanzania of over 1 million people, that provides very robust demand to the peripheral area, to the rural peripheral area where you can get into the city fairly quickly, where you can produce, vegetables and fruits that don't store terribly well and have to go to market quickly and be consumed quickly. So, all of that has been happening and is extremely important. And then, as you say, one of the kind of weird things, it's not weird in the sense that you don't see it in East Asia, is that rather usually in these peri-urban areas of high yield agriculture, in East Asia, all the action would be coming from smallholder farmers. In Africa, partly because governments have been pretty hopeless at supporting smallholder farmers. I mean, they'll say, there's free fertilizer, whatever, but it all gets taken by larger scale farmers usually, or almost all gets taken by them. I mean, there's just, people, it's quite, I mean, to my mind, it's quite a kind of aristocratic view, the African one. Right? It's like people, politics just doesn't relate to ordinary people very well. So what you see, and Tanzanian cities are, classic example, when you go and wander around the peri-urban areas looking at the high yield agriculture, is you find not the people you would expect to find, or you would find in East Asia. You find, the land, there's 10 hectares being farmed by people working for the local police chief. There's, 30 hectares being farmed by the guy from the driver licensing agency. It's like all these, or I mean, in Ghana, they have an annual like Farmer of the Year competition, right? And I point out in the book that a year not far from when I was there, it was won by a primary school teacher who was farming 1,000 hectares, right? I mean, it's like, and you meet these people, you say, but surely you've got a job. Oh yeah, but I've got plenty of time, on the side. And so this is the kind of phenomenon that you see really around Africa, of these usually urban professionals, often people in government jobs. And sometimes there's a reason for it. Like in Nigeria, agriculture is the only thing that a government civil servant can legally do on the side.
Right.
so they're all in it. And it's not developmentally great, because developmentally you want the gains spread as broadly as possible, because that creates an ideal demand for relatively simple products and services that you can produce locally. When you get income gains narrowly concentrated, what happens is that they go to people who then spend a high proportion of their money on imports. So it's a Japanese car. They send their kids abroad to college, and that doesn't help. That doesn't help your development. But that is, for better or for worse, the shape of developing agriculture in most African countries, I would say. And also, you get young graduates, quite highly educated people who see, farming 10, 15, 20 hectares as an interesting entrepreneurial opportunity.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean the stat that stuck out for me on this, especially this phenomenon of these urban professionals kind of farming in the peri-urban areas. I think you cited a survey that showed it was like something like smallholders serving urban markets were like 10 times more likely than other farmers to use improved seeds and
Yeah,
fertilizer and invest in soil
yeah,
conservation.
yeah.
Again, just because they have the incentive, because they've got this reliable urban market with urban demand
Because
that's
the
providing.
market's there, because they can make money. And so, of course, why not maximize your yield, right?
Right.
And because they're also usually, I would say, renting in peri-urban areas.
Interesting.
Most of these sort of farmer entrepreneurs tend to be, yeah, there's some purchase, but there's a lot of renting goes on as well. So
Mm.
if you're renting the land, and land rental costs, um, oh, I don't know, I'm trying to remember, in Tanzania, maybe $100. They usually rented by the season, $100 a season, $150 a season for really good land.
Hmm.
But you know, once you're paying that kind of money, you might as well absolutely maximize what you can get off the land.
Mm. And just a couple more on this demographics question in cities. In your conversation about, well, it comes up a few times throughout the book, but like Africa's historical state evolution, you cite, Charles Tilley's story of early European state formation, and Jeffrey Herbst, who basically takes Tilley to Africa. Um, and this story goes basically something like states make war and war makes states. That's the famous sort of Tillian synopsis. But because in your story of Africa's low population density, not a lot of interstate wars have occurred because people just exit, right? And so state
Yeah,
building is stalled. But I think because I love Tilly, I go back to it pretty frequently. I think most people leave out a key part of the like Tillian thesis, right? The book is called Capital and Coercion, and the capital part is the cities and their role in financing emerging states. And so
yeah.
to me, like a more complete version of Tilly's story is, yes, states make war and war makes states, but cities fund states. And you kind of outline how this is the case in the African context around density's effects, especially on the viability of infrastructure projects. So do you want to go into this kind of infrastructure story a bit?
You mean in terms of reducing the capita
Per unit
cost of
cost? Yeah.
infrastructure?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on financing, in terms of what you say and what Tilly says, I think that's kind of critical. I mean, throughout European history, the consolidation of states was fundamentally connected to the development of cities, um, because it's much easier to raise tax in cities, and it's also easier to borrow money from financial entities. And
And
in fact,
and urban merchants are more bought into a growing
yeah,
economy and supportive infrastructure for commerce and trade, right?
yeah, absolutely. And so, Africa so far has had very weak governments. I mean, there's a lot of bluster, but you look at what they can actually do, and Africa's had very weak governments. And so Africa needs to increase tax take. I mean, I don't know what the average for the whole of Africa is, but I mean, you're basically looking at between 10 and 15% of GDP in total fiscal take, which is incredibly low. Interesting is where China was at the end of the 1980s before its growth began, and the government has got to become wealthier in order to do more, and the government has to do a lot in a poor country because it is fundamentally different to a developed country. And I mean, in a developed country, there's all kinds of different repositories of capability, and everyone, and it's too complex for government to. But in a poor country, there's a lot of very straightforward stuff that government needs to do in
Mm.
agriculture and manufacturing. So all of that's important. It's just occurred to me. I mean, another example of why you need cities. So, I mean, if you think back to if you think of the U.S., you think back to the American Civil War. A reason why the North won that's not often repeated
Right.
is the North had big cities, right, and the South didn't. The
Yeah.
South had like little towns, and it really hurt the capacity of the Confederates to raise money to fight the war. Um, so yeah, the growth of cities in Africa is very, very important, and the reduction in the cost of infrastructure is also extremely important, because Africa has desperate need of infrastructure to connect what are still very large spaces, right? I mean, we can say that Africa is now almost in demographic density terms where Asia was in 1960, but Asia has since moved on to triple that
Right.
demographic density, right? In the process of becoming a wealthy part of the world. Um, so yeah, that is hugely important. The problems in Africa tend to be, and I mean, of course, this is, I guess, your bread and butter. That it's another thing that the development of cities is another thing that governments haven't really gotten their hands around,
Right.
and haven't understood that demographic density within cities is extremely important as well. And if you
Right.
let them kind of sprawl out, then you end up, as you often do in African cities, with poor working people spending an insane share of their income on transportation, apart from anything
Yeah.
else.
I think in
And
Dar, it's they spend on average. This was a few years ago, but over like 53% of their daily budget is on transport commute time,
yeah,
which is
so
insane.
it's like you've got the population, but you're throwing away the benefit.
Mm.
If you don't manage urban development in the way that is necessary to allow more rapid accumulation, better tax collection, all this kind of stuff.
Okay, this is this is good. We've hit on the demographics a bit, and this is kind of right at the start. There is a bunch of other history you go over in the first 100 pages before getting to the four success cases of Mauritius, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Botswana. And that first 100 pages, I got to tell you, is pretty grim reading, because you go over basically why Africa has remained poor for a long, for a long time in its history. And there's the demographics point, which we've already chatted about in depth. There's also this, obviously crappy colonial legacy. There's low education. There's a huge disease burden. I also didn't know about the elephants. Like that was incredibly interesting.
Yeah,
And then there's
Tanzania was one of the worst places for elephants, right? For kind of elephant devastation of farmland.
what was the? Can you say the number just for listeners? I forget the exact. 25 million was it?
Yeah, that's the estimate for 1800, right? There's 25 million elephants.
So if you're a farmer, you're going to have tough times
So
growing crops.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, have you tried kind of waving a stick at a bull elephant?
Yeah. So okay, the point is, a ton of these factors that constrain economic development. I didn't ethnic division in like pretty artificially drawn states is another issue. And so reading through the first 100 pages, it seems daunting. But the book, I think, in stressing the importance of policy decisions, right, and policy reform, really says that these histories can be overcome with human agency, right? And so my question is, what are the like pressures or the broader structural trends, I think beyond the demographic stuff we've already talked about, that are improving the possibilities of overcoming these historical endowments?
Well, once you start to get a bit of growth, then people become more optimistic about having a better life in 10 years. And actually, already, when you survey people in Africa, they're more optimistic than people in Europe, about how they're going to be in 15 years. So that's a very positive change. Um, and then I think other things, moving in favor of development would include, I think the African Union is in somewhat better shape than it was a decade or two ago. That Africa is becoming a little more cooperative. And I think a lot of development is probably going to come through if it's possible. If the free trade area can actually get delivered, I think a lot of development is going to come through that, because people tend naturally to think, well, Africa's got to export. Africa does have to export, but you can export within Africa, right?
Mm.
So you've already got 1.5 billion people. 2050, you're going to have 2.5 billion people. And that's a hell of a market. And as GDP rises, it also gives you negotiating power with the rest of the world. And when going towards the end of this century, you're going to have two dominant demographic blocks. There'll be Asia, which will already have dropped from 5 billion to 4 billion,
Mm.
because many Asian countries, including most obviously China, are now depopulating quite quickly. And then you'll have Africa at 4 billion, and the rest of the world will be 2 billion. Well, that means that Africa is going to have a big place at the international table. Even though it will probably still be relatively significantly poorer than elsewhere. And I think a lot of growth in the manufacturing sector can be achieved in Africa through the growth of intra-African trade.
Hmm. Okay, so this is great. So on to some other questions, right? One of the things I picked up in the book, you're pretty pessimistic on mining because it doesn't create a lot of jobs. Um, but let me,
I'm not. I mean, Curtis, I wouldn't say that I'm pessimistic. If anybody thinks that it's going to be transformative, I'm pessimistic. But I'm not saying don't mine. I mean,
you're right.
if you can make
But
money out of mining, I'm just making a very obvious point that it does not create many jobs.
and
Right?
it's kind of cut
Every
off.
year, yeah, and
Yep.
every year it creates fewer and fewer jobs because of increased mechanization. Um, so, I'm just saying, that's not the solution to having to generate employment for these millions of new workers who come into the market each year.
Right. But on this point of mechanization, right? Is there a plausible argument made? I think it's actually being made right by some economists today that manufacturing factories in 2026 and beyond, they're much more capital intensive beasts and less labor intensive than they used to be. So their job creation potential is also a lot less, kind of creating a similar problem as you lay out with mining. Like I think Danny Roderick, for example, writes on this issue of premature deindustrialization, right?
Yeah, I don't buy that. And I talked briefly with Danny Roderick, and he read the manuscript, and he was very positive actually. But on that point, we have to sort of agree to disagree. In my view, two things are kind of usually left out of the conversation about robotics in manufacturing and AI in manufacturing. One is simple question of cost. I mean, people talk about robotics as if you just get the stuff for free. You don't. You have to buy it, right? And robots in factories cost a lot of money. So if you're in a garmenting factory, you can't actually do a lot with robots in garmenting factories because material isn't rigid, and so robots find it very hard. But there are some things that you can do. But a basic robotic machine in a garmenting factory will be $100,000. So I'm going to spend $100,000 on that, which I've got to spend up front in when I'm in Madagascar, and I can get like hire or fire labor for $65 a month. That's skilled labor in terms of garmenting and people who've been doing this for years. And I don't see why people are going to start taking a much more capital intensive approach when labor costs are what they now are in Africa as a result of population growth.
Mm,
Um, and the second thing is that um, robots are actually remarkably inflexible, right? You set up a production line and it has a given throughput. And if you get extra demand, you can't suddenly magic up another robot and stick it in there. I mean, that's basically what your production line is. And equally, if you don't have demand, you're still paying, the debt cost of buying these robots. Whereas
mm,
when you've got people, you hire them in or you fire them. And I'm saying that in Africa, but it's not only in Africa that we see it. I mean, um, for instance, with blind warehouses and supermarkets during COVID, when everyone was ordering food to be delivered at home in Europe and the US, people with blind warehouses and robots to pick everything out really suffered because
mm.
they couldn't step up to the higher level of demand. Um, so I think, like, as with all technological moments of progress, the progress is real, but you get this kind of conversation that takes place among techies that is kind of divorced from the real world. Um, and then, probably 15 years later or something, what they were saying becomes more applicable. So I don't think that there's a problem for Africa to have a manufacturing sector if you're suggesting that it will, and compete successfully with highly capitalized robot operated factories.
Interesting. I just continuing on manufacturing. You write a lot about the use of industrial parks. I mean, especially in particular cases like Ethiopia, but there are also special economic zones. Where in the Mauritian case, and slightly in the Rwandan case. I'm less sure about Botswana, but in your reading, what are the most common or like fatal errors that African governments make when setting up and operationalizing these special economic zones?
Well, I think to imagine that you just sort of put a fence around a zone and all these foreign businesses will arrive and it will take off. I mean, a zone has to be, if it's going to work, it has to be planned in integration with port services, road transport, so on and so forth. And I think there've been quite a lot of zones have been done in the past um, in Africa. They're not properly planned, and then of course you get the problem where you get more sort of federal um, polities like Nigeria, where things get put in places that you're not going to put them for economic
Right.
reasons. They get put there for federal reasons, right? Because everybody's got to have one. And and it was like, but this isn't a purely African problem where you do get quite a lot of sort of federal political arrangements and other similar things. I mean, it was the same in China at the point at which Deng Xiaoping said that some must get rich first.
Hmm.
Which seems like self-evident to people in Europe and the US, but was a very radical thing to say in China at the time, because Chinese socialism said that no, we're all going to get rich together. But Deng came out and said no, that hasn't worked. Some will have to get rich first.
Mm. Because having studied both the Asian case and the African case, do you have a sense about why Asian zones were just like so much more successful than they've been across the African continent, spurring like industrial firm growth and job creation? You can't really
Well,
compare the success stories.
yeah, I mean, okay, so first of all, they were fully integrated with port services and road services. I mean, if you go back to the early American semiconductor firms that were lured into Singapore, it was all very nicely set up for them so that the whole thing was clearly going to work. And beyond that, the creation of zones, um, largely followed the growth of outsourcing of manufacturing
Mm,
into Asia. So it was kind of going with the grain of the wood. Whereas, in Africa, it tended in the past to be the case that countries were saying, well, we just build a zone and then we'll get all the foreign investment. But actually, there are a lot of other reasons that companies didn't want to come and invest in Africa. And one was labor cost, which only really in the last 10, 15, just in the course of this century, it's only then that labor cost has started to become genuinely attractive in Africa, and again, a function of the demographic story.
mm. I'll point listeners to some research by Susan Frick, and there's a couple other Andreas Rodriguez Pose and a few others on. They had a data set of like 350 zones across the globe. I think it was 22 lower middle income countries. Um, I think the only two factors that were like reliably predictive of growth, and growth was proxied by nightlight data, luminosity within these zones over a period of time. The only two predictive factors across a bunch of models were proximity to urban markets, again similar to this story that you've already told. The zones closer to the cities tended to do better. This is kind of your connective to port infrastructure and whatnot, and existing labor pools. And then the second one was size. So the larger the zone, the better. And this is, I think I take this second point on size to mean some smaller zones, like even single factory zones. That to me is just a rent seeking, like a
Yeah,
way to funnel corruption rather than be serious about. And so the larger the zone, the more it's kind of probably less to do with rent seeking and corruption, and more like seriously trying to pursue industrial firm formation. What are your thoughts?
yeah. I think that makes. I think that makes sense. But I also think that the aggression with which a government goes out and markets um, zones is going to make a difference too. Before the Civil War, I think that the Ethiopians did a pretty good job. I mean, there were some things I didn't agree with. They did have some zones that were positioned for federal reasons,
Yeah.
but generally, they made sure that the utilities and the infrastructure were aligned with the development of these zones. And then they went out and did a very hard sell, and they filled up, for instance, Hawassa, which is quite a big zone, filled it up very quickly. So, again, I think that this stuff is doable in Africa. What concerns me is, whether countries are going to develop the bureaucratic capacity quickly enough to get these things done when they really need to be done in terms of generating employment.
Mm,
Um, but I mean, again, you can look at Rwanda, you can look at Ethiopia, and over a period of 10 to 20 years, they created, very focused bureaucracies, that really have that kind of developmental state feel.
mhm.
Everybody's getting shit done,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. Mellis called it like he wants to make development hegemonic, right? Like that was the
Yes.
term. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A couple things on we talked about manufacturing. A couple things on the agriculture side. So first on land reform, you're a big fan, as you've already mentioned, of smallholder agriculture, both in the Asia book and this one, because smaller farms, basically you call it gardening, are found to grow more per hectare than large farms. So then by that logic, redistributing land from large landholders to small ones should increase productivity and output. Um, my main thing with land reform is that, right, it's incredibly politically difficult sometimes, even for really dedicated elites, right? So in your East Asian examples, um, in the Asia book, these places, I think, by and large, had the like most successful land reforms at scale anywhere on the globe. And I think a big reason for their success was they were in essence like externally imposed, right? Japan was under General Marshall, South Korea also influenced by the US, Taiwan by the KMT. um, so given a lot of the successful land reforms were basically kind of force fed to these countries by external forces, does this sort of give you pause on its political tractability in Africa?
Well, it's not required in Africa, right? Because there are still very few landless farmers. I mean, there will be more going forward because of the agglomeration of land by urban professionals that we were talking about before. But there's not a major land ownership issue and landlessness issue. And in the book, I mean, I mentioned Che Guevara turning up in the 60s in
Oh.
DRC to start a revolution. And then, he says, take me to your landless peasants. And so what? So we haven't got any landless peasants. Everyone's got land. And then he, he, Che Guevara, right, in his diaries, how am I supposed to start a revolution? And I mean, and then well, the World Bank's estimate is that half of the globe's cultivable, unused but cultivable land is in Africa. Um, so the very few places in Africa that you could even begin to make a case for land reform. The one where there was a case for land reform and it was made by the Labour Party in the 1950s was in Mauritius.
Mm.
And they were contemplating land reform because there you had these Franco-Mauritian sugar barons with huge estates, thousands of hectares, and large numbers of other people who'd been ethnic Indians who'd been imported as indentured labor to work on the sugar plantations, who didn't, then wanted, after independence, wanted some land of their own. But they decided that they would not carve up the sugar estates, but what they did instead was to tax sugar very heavily, and also to create a single entity to export all sugar, because the sugar barons in the past had tended to take their money offshore and then invest in South Africa and wherever. So they stopped that. All the sugar had to go through the Sugar Export Agency. So all the money came into the Sugar Export Agency, and they taxed it. And the tax went up to about 26% of gross value, which is a hell of a tax.
Mm.
And then they used that to they used the money for a number of things, but they used it to in part to finance the development of manufacturing policy. And then they gave the sugar barons very attractive tax terms if they would go and make garments. And it was great. It worked. It was just classic East Asian policy, carrot and stick, and worked fantastically well. I mean, the sugar barons hated it initially, and the old ones can still remember what it was like and still complain about how mistreated they were. But it pushed them into manufacturing, and they then ended up in the end with far bigger businesses than they had before.
Mm. I guess then, instead of land reform in the African case, maybe let's just call it land regularization, right? Because
Mm.
even registering, like I think Rwanda has had a super successful national land regularization drive. I think they did in 2008 to
Yeah,
2012 or
yeah,
something like that. They registered like 11 million plots across the country
yeah,
for
yeah,
$7 a parcel. Is like amazing. But other
yeah.
than that, I can't, like Tanzania still only has 5% of its land registered, like properly, right? And
Yeah,
so,
I don't think that is a priority. Personally, I don't think is a priority. But you know that aid is basically a fashion business, and
yeah.
it's means like a
DeSoto was
huge.
the land, the private property land.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
land rights and land privatization has been just like a huge kind of fashion thing in aid. I don't, you know, I mean, in some places in Africa where there've been aid funded projects, it's kind of done negative things because usually when you have, communal land and then it's privatized, what happens is that politically most powerful people
Right.
lay their hands on a disproportionate share of the land. So it's kind of better having it communal because everyone knew what established practice was. Yeah, I mean, even in Rwanda, I mean, the British Foreign Office will tell you how fabulously that went, the demarcation of land in Rwanda, because they paid for quite a lot of it. But if you look at the impact that it's had, when people buy and sell land in Rwanda, there's still only a tiny share who bother to go to a lawyer. They just do it, right? Because
Yeah.
because a lawyer costs money,
Yeah.
and people are so cost sensitive that they'd rather kind of take a bit of a chance that it'll be okay than pay a lawyer to give them something that to give them a contract that they could more easily take to court.
Yeah. And I buy this, I've become less of a kind of privatization of land fundamentalist after reading more of the Asian story, because like none of the like, China had uh, all land is owned by publicly, and they what they did under Deng post 1978, I guess, starting with a few areas and then slowly rolling it out, was like, land leasing, leasing use rights to land. They didn't have sort
Yeah,
of fully
yeah.
private kind of freehold land in the sense that is known in Europe and North America, but they leased out the use rights to that land for
Yeah,
varying
you
periods of
can
time.
exactly. You can
Yeah.
lease the use rights now, but also pretty much everyone who farms in China now has like a piece of paper from the government that says that this land that they're farming, and defined in on the piece of paper, that this land is theirs to farm, and it gives them, and they get a degree of sort of ownership clarity from that. And actually, in practice, people say that turns out to be quite important because it prevents like local government coming along and saying, actually, this
Right.
land doesn't belong to you, it belongs to us. So we're now going to give it to this Taiwanese horticulture company.
Okay. And just relatedly on I guess this question of land reform, have you read? It's some recent research by Oliver Kim and some co-authors, economists, that pretty rigorously go. I think they look at the Taiwan case, and then they look at mainland China's household responsibility system, um, and the findings suggest that it had a smaller impact on yields than had originally been thought. I'm curious if you'd come across
I
the
have.
research.
So I read it, and I think, I don't know if I spoke to him or if I had some exchanges back and forth. I mean, I kind of personally, I think it's a bit of a straw man thing, because it's what it's saying is, oh, the divvying up of land in land reform didn't affect yields. The yield gains came from fertilizer, hybrid seed, and whatever. But what I actually, if you go back to how Asia works and read what I actually said, is that you know the combination of these things produced these tremendous yield gains. And for me, the land reform was not so important on the yield side, although if it contributes something to yields, that's all good. It was ultimately most important in terms of equalizing land ownership and allowing all these landless people in densely populated East Asian societies to have a piece of land and a piece of capital so that they could participate meaningfully in capitalism. And the paper doesn't address that. It doesn't say, is there a case for land reform in terms of the the equality of asset distribution in a poor society.
Mm, yeah. Oliver's great, but he's a great Substack, and he just reviewed your book, and he had some very nice things to say on it. So it just came out, I think, literally this morning. I saw it in my inbox. So, um, I guess while on the topic of Asia still, and I think you mentioned this a little early, but on the demographics point, I think right you rightly stress the need for a sort of Asian style demographic dividend, right? A large working age population. But you could also make the case that Asia like very much overshot on demography. Like most Asian countries are significantly below replacement. South Korea is, I think, like the lowest in the world. They're just not having kids, and all of their respective populations are therefore set to like crater over the next few decades. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is, shouldn't this be like a word of caution to up and coming governments today to not ride the family planning train too hard in pursuit of this demographic dividend?
But so getting people to have more kids today is going to encourage those kids to have more kids in the future, you reckon?
I don't think that's what we're not. Yeah, we're not seeing like encouraging people to have more kids as results in more of the future. It's more like not tanking the decline in total factor productivity or total fertility rate so quickly as it's declined. Because
But
I
I mean,
think that
it's not going to happen in Africa, right? Because governments don't have the capacity to make that happen. Plus, they're not going to go around sterilizing people like the Chinese did. So in Africa, if it's done, it's going to be done through more female education, which is strongly correlated with reduced fertility as a result of later um, fertility. And I think it's important because the getting the demographic dividend in better shape in Africa is very important to Africa's chances. So, in other words, having that larger working age population relative, in particular, to the population of kids. And then, right, so then you get to maybe, some countries in Africa will get to China or Korea or Japan's position. But I would say that, at least then you've got rich people problems. And rich people problems are definitely better than poor people problems.
yeah, fair. That's fair. Yeah. Um, let's change gears a little bit on the foreign assistance and aid side of things. You kind of touch upon it towards the end of the book, right? We saw like huge sweeping cuts to foreign aid last year in 2025 across high income countries, especially like the slashing of U.S. aid. Um, so let's say it's a few years from now, Trump's term is done, a new president is elected who decides, lo and behold, to reinstitute like some version of USAID. And you, Joe Studwell, you can influence how the newly constituted thing works with African governments. Like we know your sort of general policy recipe that you'd advocate for, but I'm more asking about how aid agencies in a reconstituted thing should work with or not beneficiary governments. What kind of changes would you advise from the status
I
quo way
mean,
this work is done?
I would say go back to how things were done in the era of Harry Truman, which means that, when you give aid to a foreign country, you really give them aid. You don't tell them that they've got to buy American product and American services. You don't allow Congress to earmark every bit of that aid to be spent in a certain way, despite the extraordinary ignorance of people in Congress about what really goes on in foreign countries. And instead, you go back to the sort of Truman era problem solving when American aid, for instance, was given to South Korea and to Taiwan. And a lot of money was given in terms of share of GDP, way more than Africa's ever had. But that that money was enormously helpful and game changing for those economies because it was given on the basis of right, let's just solve the problems, and that doesn't rule out anything. If you look at what US aid was doing before it had closed down, the thing had already been largely emasculated. It was big, right? So one piece of US aid was just like delivering bags of wheat to combat zones where American troops were active, right? I mean, it wasn't aid at all, in a sense of sort of building a society and an economy, um, and other stuff was going based on agendas for, um, you've got to develop democracy. I mean, like, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is this, and that still exists because Trump won't get rid of that. That was created under Baby
Bush.
Bush.
Bush. Yeah.
And they have like a list of things you have to apply, and you've got to show that you're free and democratic and everything. And it's like, so rather than go out and solve problems, you just start off with a checklist of a kind of wish list of what you want, and they don't even apply it. So at the moment, for instance, they're doing a load of work in Morocco, right? Morocco is an absolute monarchy, right? It's not democratic, but they've ticked the box for democracy because it's got a parliament because they want to do some work there. So the whole thing becomes a kind of political farce rather than spending hard-earned taxpayers' money to make the world a better place.
Mm. Okay, this is a great segue. You mentioned Morocco. You'll be at the Growth Summit in Morocco next month in late March. The Africa Urban Lab will be there too. There'll be a nice chunk of funders there. I think less on the aid side, more on just the philanthropic side. Interested in funding actual doers and organizations like trying to move the needle on economic growth. So let's say you get put in charge of deciding how to allocate a nice boatload of this funding. What actual doers or organizations do you back, and why? And this can be nonprofits. It can be you can try to invest it in for-profit entities in interesting ways. It can be like high-level policy advocacy of the stuff that like Stefan Durkin is doing right now around kind of forming elite bargains at the high level. Be creative.
Um, so I don't know the philanthropic world terribly well. I mean, I get approached from time to time, but it's a bit kind of um, it's a bit of a kind of shotgun thing. But I mean, I've known One Acre for a long time, and I think that's a good, my kind of aid operation. So it's a defined target, right? They basically target the missing finance bit for smallholder farmers, provide them fertilizer or solar lights or whatever on credit. They have grown very well, started and run by young people who are very can do and very good with data. They're very good at measuring the impact of what they do. And if you look at the cost, I'm going to say a number, but I might be wrong. But I think that if you look at the gap between what they spend and what they get back, so in other words, the bit that has to be financed by aid money, I think that I think it's maybe $25 a year per farmer, and that the average impact on output per hectare that they have is over 40%. So it's good. And then I think at a sort of more kind of planning intellectual level, there's a number of things going on that are of interest. I like what Yaki Cilias does at Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. I don't know a lot about what you guys are doing, but certainly I think the whole urban development thing is incredibly important, and I'm not sure it's really on the political radar at the moment. So if you can get it more on the political radar, but then you've got to come up with, things that are affordable and straightforward that governments can do. Um, so yeah, there are tons of groups doing stuff, and I can't give you a more comprehensive list because it's not something that I do. I just kind of interact with people as I meet them, really in the aid area.
Hmm. Although I think you said at the beginning that it was Bill Gates and like Omidyar Network or something who called you in and got you to write this book, right? So pretty big. You've had some pretty big interactions with the philanthropic world, right?
Well, that was just because Gates liked the Asia book so much. So then I was asked to go over to Seattle, and I did and met him. And we talked about Asia for an hour. And at the end of it, he said, "Well, what I really want to know is what you think about Africa." But I didn't do anything at the time because I thought I don't know anything about Africa, so what am I going to do? But I think, yeah, I think Gates is very interesting. I mean, you know, my observation with Bill Gates would be that he's just he's a total scientist, right? So if it's a problem for which there's a scientific solution, he's very good at it. And I think the stuff they do on the health side is extraordinary. If it's a problem where the solution is more organizational, he struggles more.
Mm,
And then I also wonder, why, given how much money there is, he won't have a go and do a bit of infrastructure.
mm,
I don't know
interesting.
why he won't have a sort of, a few Gates expressways.
Well, I mean, there you go. If yeah, presumably you have some sway if he approached you for this book, and you've made the case, I think, pretty well in this book that agriculture, benefits immensely in terms of yields once it has better market access and road connectivity and integration with demand areas. So, I think there's a strong case to be made. Um, but why don't lastly here we just wrap up, right? You finished your PhD, so I guess I should call you Dr. Studwell. You finished this book. Um, what are you working on next?
I don't know. I'm kind of I've got a few things, a few quick things that I'm doing. But I'm looking for what I'm going to do next. So if you have any great ideas, you should let me know. I mean, I'd like to continue to work on Africa because I think mainly because um, East Asia, Asia now, the poverty's almost gone. So
Right.
the stuff that I find most interesting, which is kind of getting agriculture moving and then going on from agriculture moving into agricultural processing and the beginning of manufacturing, that game is over, right? And certainly in East Asia, I mean, there may be a little bit more to come in Southeast Asia and India, but I find Africa more interesting, and I really enjoyed doing this book. I mean, I just, I thought, I met a lot of really decent, hardworking people, and I thought, no, it's all right.
Well, it was a great book, and if you're looking for things to do after this, I have plenty of ideas for you, Joe, that we'll talk about after we hit the stop button here. But that's all I think for the podcast. The book for listeners is How Africa Works. Highly recommended, especially and incredibly self-servingly the parts on cities and urbanization. So, Joe Studwell, thank you for coming on, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Africa Urban Lab podcast. To listen to our other episodes, follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And pretty please, if you liked the episode, share it with your friends and your network. It really, really helps grow the show. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you. Thanks so much.